On the American frontier, the fight for land and resources produced some of the most brutal incidents of international and intertribal warfare in the world, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. There were no rules nor limitations on weaponry, no quarter shown to non-combatants, and no mercy for those who dared to take what was not theirs. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral as we examine one of the most brutal and little-known events in the history of the American frontier, the Poison Bullet Ambush of 1836. Montana, 1836. In the middle of the night, in the dead of winter, a young fur trapper named Isaac P. Rose shakes himself free from the warmth of the buffalo robe he has been sleeping in and rises to his feet. In a daze, the man wanders into the freezing, ominous darkness of the woods that surround his and his companion's small campsite. He trudges to a spot a few dozen yards away, feeling inextricably drawn to a small clearing just beyond the tree line. As he comes into view of the clearing, he is shocked to see the hulking figure of a lone grizzly bear. For the veteran mountain man, the sight of a grizzly bear here in the wilds near Clark's Fork on the Yellowstone River is not at all unusual. However, this grizzly is standing on his hind legs, nearly 8 feet tall, and staring intently at the bewildered man. Locking eyes with Rose, the bear walks up to the man, striding in an eerily human-like gait, and speaks. He tells Rose, in a deep, steady voice, to shake his hand. Rose, more confused than afraid, offers the hulking beast his left hand. The bear refuses to take it. Rose, sensing the animal's offense, hurriedly extends his right hand instead. At this, the bear silently and solemnly shakes the man's hand with both of his massive paws. Then, the bear suddenly disappears with a gust of icy wind. Just as suddenly, Rose finds himself awakened by the morning sun, still wrapped in the warm buffalo blanket. It had all, of course, been a dream. Rose and his fellow mountain men, a party composed of himself, as well as Joe Meek, Jack Larison, and Mark Heed, have departed from their main company to procure meat for their starving comrades. The main party, under the leadership of the legendary mountain man Jim Bridger, are camped 30 miles away. They are counting on Rose and their other comrades to ease the troublesome burden of surviving the harsh winter at hand. They have thus far been successful, as they have managed to kill so many buffalo that, after one day's hunt, 4 of the 8 horses that have been brought along to pack the meat now find themselves burdened by full loads. The snow is deep, and travel has been slow. With another long, cold day ahead of them, the 4 trappers begin to pack their things and make ready for travel. As they do this, Rose recounts his strange dream to his companions, partly for their amusement, and partly hoping one of them might proffer an explanation as to the meaning of it. He tells them how Caleb, the colloquial name amongst the mountain men for the grizzly bear, had come to him in a dream, that he had spoken and only shaken his right hand. Joe Meek, another veteran trapper, shakes his head and lowers his concerned eyes on Rose. "You better look out, Rose, or you'll shake hands with Beelzebub before night." While the grizzly bear certainly instills a healthy sense of respect and fear in any mountain man, what they fear most is coming into contact with Beelzebub. Though this name is used in the New Testament for the devil, that is not the image that comes to the typical trapper's mind when they hear the word. For these men, the most fearful entity that they might encounter here in the wilds, thousands of miles from their places of birth, is not the grizzly, nor is it the venomous snakes, nor buffalo stampedes, wolves, mountain lions, flash floods, avalanches, or wildfires. For the mountain men, their greatest fear is the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot, or Siksika, had originated in the northeast, near the area between modern-day Maine and Canada. They would eventually make their way to the Great Lakes region, and then, even further west, to the expanses of the plains of present-day Alberta, Canada, and the state of Montana. They had subsisted in these unforgiving environs for centuries as foot-bound hunters. Before the introduction of the horse into the Blackfoot culture in the 18th century, they had survived by chasing buffalo herds off of cliffs, gathering at the bottom to butcher the animals. Their cultural transformation to a horse-based people who hunted, conducted warfare, and traveled on horseback was delayed far longer than tribes further south. This was due more to geography than anything else, as the Blackfoot's northerly location placed them farther away from the large populations of horses found in Mexico and Texas. But, however forestalled their transformation might have been, it had also been incredibly rapid and incredibly consequential on the northern plains. The Blackfoot had quickly mastered hunting and fighting from atop charging mounts and had proven the most formidable power in the area for decades by the time Isaac Rose and his comrades ventured into their territory in the 1830s. During the winter months, which can often amount to more than half the year in these northernmost reaches of the Great Plains, the Blackfoot set up their villages in wooded river valleys. On the rare occasion that they venture out from these quarters, it is generally to partake in the same practice as Rose and his companions. They hunt the buffalo herds that hunker down in wooded areas and harvest as many as they can carry back in order to sustain their families and community until the long-awaited end of winter. For their part, the buffalo are more than simply a main food source of the Blackfoot. For the Blackfoot, nearly every tool and furnishing at their disposal comes, in some form or fashion, from the buffalo. Properly known as the American bison or plains bison, they are the largest animal on the North American continent. The largest males can weigh upwards of 2,000 pounds and be incredibly unpredictable. They roam virtually the entirety of the middle of the continent, from northern Canada to Mexico, in what is known as the Bison Belt. At their peak, most experts estimate their population to range from 30 to 50 million, with some estimates being as high as 75 million. Their thick hides provide the material with which the Blackfoot and other plains tribes construct their teepees. Their bones, hooves, and horns are used to construct tools and cooking utensils. Bison meat is, of course, the basis of the Blackfoot diet. Roasted, fried, boiled, dried, or raw, it can be prepared and consumed in a variety of manners. To the Blackfoot, the buffalo are a sacred gift from their creator, one meant to sustain their way of life and livelihood. As such, they see fit to protect their resources by any means necessary. Since the buffalo herds are such an important resource for the Blackfoot, any incursion into their territory, and especially any hunting of the buffalo on that territory, is seen as an offense punishable by death. Hugh Monroe, a Canadian fur trapper who was adopted into the Blackfoot, gives his account of how viciously the Blackfoot dealt with intruders, even of other native tribes. After finding a still smoldering campfire of a neighboring tribe referred to as the River People, the Blackfoot whom Monroe was living with became inconsolably irate and set on revenge. He asked one warrior, a man named Lone Walker, what had happened. Monroe's account is as follows. "The campers here were river people," said Lone Walker. "We have forbidden them to come over here to our plains, but they keep coming and stealing our buffaloes. We shall now make them cry." "You are going to fight them?" asked Monroe. "Yes," said Lone Walker. "I shivered," recalls Monroe. "In my mind's eye, I saw a great battle of arrows flying and guns booming, and men falling and crying out in their death and agony. And for what? Just a few buffalo that blackened the plains?" "Don't fight," pleaded Monroe. "There are plenty of buffaloes. Let the river people go in peace with what they have killed." "But," the Canadian recalled, "he gave me no answer other than a grim smile, and rode out to meet the head of the Blackfoot column. In the ensuing fight, the Blackfoot would kill 7 of the river people's warriors, as their women and children fled in a desperate panic. All 7 dead warriors would be scalped and otherwise mutilated, as equal parts punishment and warning. Afterwards, a great celebration was held. In their present circumstances, Rose and his fellow trappers are, of course, well aware of the danger their venture has placed them in. However, they are also aware that the buffalo meat they return to their company with could quite literally be the difference between a relatively comfortable winter and possibly starving to death in the middle of nowhere. And so now, for the time being, they are not dissuaded from their job at hand. The four men plan to continue on with their day, spending it much the same as they had the day before. Rose, the most reliable shot, would fall a buffalo, and then they would all set into quartering and packing the meat. However, after seeing several hundred of the animals, they have proven so unusually skittish that Rose cannot get close enough to get off a shot. This suspicious behavior spells only one sure thing, according to the veteran mountain man's instincts: that the Blackfoot are nearby. The trappers agree that their best course of action is to return to the camp with the buffalo meat they have been able to procure so far. They head southeast, through rolling hills. As the men ride, conversation is kept to a minimum, and their eyes continually scan the landscape around them. They all know that being caught with a bounty of buffalo meat will likely spell a torturous end at the hands of the Blackfoot. This end could certainly come via a variety of tortures routinely employed by almost all Plains tribes. These included being staked out in the summer sun, burned under red-hot coals, or quite literally being carved to pieces as their torturers, along with the women and children of the tribe, laugh at and chide them. But a hard death could also, as Rose and company had found out only weeks earlier, be suffered even after escaping a Blackfoot attack. A Delaware tribesman named Manhead, who had been traveling with the fur company, had been out hunting with Rose when the pair were suddenly attacked by a small group of Blackfoot warriors. Rose and Manhead had managed to make it back to camp, with Manhead suffering only a flesh wound from a bullet in his calf. But as soon as they reached camp, Manhead informed Rose that he had been hit with a dreaded poison bullet, and his demise was all but certain. Over the succeeding hours, the unfortunate Delaware would suffer an agonizing death. In his biographical work on Isaac Rose titled 4 Years in the Rockies, author James B. Marsh addresses the reader directly in how these poison bullets were made. Perhaps our readers may not be fully aware of the method resorted to by the Indians to poison their bullets. It is done this way. A small piece of buffalo meat is placed on the end of a forked stick, and a rattlesnake is induced to strike it with his fangs. This poisoned meat is then dried, pounded into a powder, and placed in a small bag. When the Indian intends to use one of these poisoned bullets, he first puts it in his mouth and chews it for some time. Then dips it into the bag, and the slightest wound from one of these bullets can cause death. As the trappers try to push these fears from their mind and focus on the task at hand, they feel an inexorable tension as the undulating terrain provides ample cover for a Blackfoot ambush. All they can hope for now is to make it back to their company's main camp and the comparative safety in numbers it provides. But after a few long hours of riding, it appears to the trappers as though they might actually make it to their destination unscathed. Then, just as they are about to reach a small ravine, a party of 8 Blackfoot spring up, screaming their defiant, powerful war cries. The lead Blackfoot warrior is scarcely 10 feet from Rose when the attack begins. Rose, in the lead, wheels his horse and is now the closest target for the Blackfoot to attack. Almost as suddenly as he can turn his horse to flee, the air is filled with the roar of gunfire, and Blackfoot musket balls whiz all around him. One of the balls passes through his cap, while another rips across his chest, leaving a jagged but shallow cut across his skin and cutting the strings of his shot pouch, causing the critical piece of weaponry to fall to the ground. Another ball passes through the wrist of his buckskin glove, again miraculously only causing minor superficial damage to the wrist. Rose's most grievous wound comes when one of the lead balls smashes into his right elbow. The ball enters just above the joint and exits through the forearm, rendering the limb all but useless for the time being. The Blackfoot warrior nearest Rose, seeing he is now incapacitated, rides forward to finish the attack. The warrior attempts to grab Rose's horse by its bridle with one hand while attempting to shove Rose from the animal. Rose uses his severely injured right hand to hang on to the reins, while he repeatedly strikes the Blackfoot warrior in the face with his riding whip. As he does this, Rose's horse panics and lurches away from the Blackfoot, taking off in a dead run in the direction of the other trappers. This is a fortuitous break for the mountain man. However, as the horse wheels around to make their escape, Rose's rifle falls from his lap. He now realizes he is severely wounded and without any means of defense save for his hunting knife and tomahawk. His only remaining hope now is to hang on for dear life as his horse makes a mad dash away from the Blackfoot. Gritting his teeth, Rose urges the animal onward, doing all he can to hang on to the reins with his one working arm. Looking behind him, he sees the Blackfoot warrior closest in pursuit stop to pick up Rose's valuable rifle from the ground, fumbling with the rifle's leather scabbard. Rose again turns his gaze forward, hunkered down as low as possible next to his horse's neck. He then hears a sound he is well familiar with, the crack of his own rifle, followed by the sound of yet another musket ball whizzing by his head. Rose's charging steed manages to catch up to the party of 3 other trappers, whose retreat has been slowed by their heavily burdened pack animals. Seeing no better option, Jack Larison cuts the straps holding the loads to the animals, leaving hundreds of pounds of meat spilled upon the rolling prairie. Larison calls out to Rose, asking, "Are you killed, old boy?" "Not killed, but badly wounded," Rose replies. "Hurry forward, boys, and save yourselves if you can." Rose and his cohorts must now cover 30 miles of prairie in order to get back to the safety of their company. In a fortuitous break for the party, the Blackfoot have halted their pursuit in order to reclaim the buffalo meat that has been dropped by the trappers. Though they are now empty-handed, they are all alive. Rose, however, is beginning to rapidly decline over the course of the ride. His arm throbs in immense pain, and he is wrought with nausea and dizziness. For hours he rides through icy winds and snow-covered grounds, his right arm dangling uselessly by his side. It is soon apparent that at least one of his wounds is the result of a poisoned bullet. As the trappers finally reach camp, it is readily apparent to all that Rose is on the verge of death. He is pulled off of his horse and carried into a tent, where Jim Bridger and a Delaware medicine man examine him. Both concur that he is the victim of a poisoned bullet, and that he has likely only survived this long due to the blood loss he has incurred during the ride. For the next few days, Rose lies in a tent, battling for his life against the effects of the poison and blood loss. His arm swells to a nearly unrecognizable mass, causing fissures in the skin at the shoulder. His nervous system becomes, in his own later words, fearfully disorganized, and even the slightest noise, light, or motion causes him great distress. His fellow trappers do all within their power to care for him, though little can be done other than keeping the wound clean and letting the man sleep as best he can. Most of his friends fear, if not outright assume, that he will not survive long. However, after about a week, the wound begins to heal. Soon, Rose is able to eat and walk, and, within a matter of only a few weeks, he is back to work, hunting and trapping. However, Rose will scarcely have regained the ability to hold down food by the time an injured scout comes riding into camp, seemingly in a full panic. The scout, a Mexican man known as Masaeno, has been shot in the ankle, though thankfully not by a poisoned bullet, and has only escaped certain death at the hands of a roving Blackfoot band by hurling himself off of a steep cliff which they were not willing to follow him down. Masaeno reports that the Blackfoot are coalescing in a winter camp on the Yellowstone River 4 miles to the south of the trappers' current location. The village is nearly 1,000 lodges strong, he says, and when they discover the trappers' location, the trappers will surely be wiped out. And so, the fight for the frontier will continue. Bridger will order his men to construct a makeshift fort, and the men to hunker down for what will be one of the most brutal encounters between native tribes and mountain men in the history of the Old West. But the accounts of that battle, as well as the countless other tales of conflict and coexistence between tribespeople and trappers, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Montana, May 1810. At their campsite on the shores of the Jefferson River, a small group of fur trappers ready themselves for another long day's work of setting and checking their traps. These men are among the first to venture into this territory, a land whose unrivaled beauty is constantly at odds with the very real and very mortal threat of hostile tribes. The trappers' shared goal is to acquire their own personal fortunes by trapping the seemingly endless supply of beaver and selling the pelts to hat manufacturers back east. The mountain men are traders and trappers, not settlers, and they are not necessarily seen as intruders by all of the tribes. In fact, many have deep ties to the native peoples, often being adopted or marrying into the tribes, and several of the fur trappers in this group hail from mixed-race families, and they are not at all considered unusual. And perhaps none among this crew of fur trappers is as representative of the meeting and mixing of cultures as 36-year-old George Druillard. Born in 1773 in old Sandwich town, Windsor, Ontario, to a French-Canadian father and a Shawnee mother, Druillard has grown up on the frontier, learning the skills required of any good woodsman, from tracking to hunting and fishing to map-making. However, since his father was a commissioned officer in the military, the young man also learned to read, write, and speak both French and English, as well as a number of native dialects, including Shawnee and Iroquois. He is also fluent in the common sign language ubiquitous here amongst most tribes of the northern plains, and this makes him a valuable man. In 1803, he was recruited by Meriwether Lewis for what would become the legendary Voyage of Discovery, in which the party of Lewis and Clark made the first incursion into the high plains, then the Rockies, and ultimately to the Pacific coast and back. Druillard had solidified his place in frontier lore with his participation in this expedition, and now he is viewed by many of the younger trappers with a sense of awe. He claims that, being as he is half native, he is as at home in the wilderness as any native in the territory, and thus is in fact quite safe roaming about freely, anywhere that he pleases. However, even the rawest rookie trappers among them assume that Druillard means this, at least in part, as a joke. For all among them are painfully, palpably aware that they are still intruding on lands that they are not welcome in. Their mere presence here, uninvited and without permission, means that they are all subject to the dangers that this entails, including violent ends at the hands of tribes like the Cheyenne, the Arikara, and, most prevalent in this area, the mighty Blackfoot. The Blackfoot have long dominated here on the northern plains. They are a warrior society whose very existence hinges on their possession of the best available hunting grounds. For well over a century now, they have proven nearly universally combative to all trespassers, and there's no reason to think that they have changed their tact. However, these dangers have been assumed by all in the party before they had even moved their expedition out from St. Louis in the first place. On that brisk morning, as the men gnawed down quick, cold breakfasts of beef jerky and pemmican, they had all decided that the danger of life as a trapper was, in the end, worth the risk. Because though there is plenty of danger to be had out here on the frontier, there is also plenty of money to be made. But the assumed risk of their job does not mean that they are foolhardy men. Every morning begins with the men getting approval for their proposed territory from the officer in charge, and then checking out the necessary gear from their quartermaster
all of which has to be meticulously recorded and later scoured over by accountants from the fur companies that they work for. The day usually begins before dawn, with the men departing camps in groups of 4. Each group then works their way up and down the tributaries of whatever major river that they are on, with 2 of them setting traps and the other 2 keeping a watch out for hostile native warriors. In general, this system does seem to provide enough security to keep the vast majority of the trappers alive. However, it does not often make them wealthy. This meticulous approach means that the profit from every pelt has to be split 4 ways, in addition to the fur companies taking their share. Thus, while their physical security is most assuredly greatly appreciated, many find the practice financially draining and more than a little frustrating. Among the most disgruntled of the men is George Druillard. With all of his knowledge and experience and what he believes to be the inherent invincibility provided by his bloodline, Druillard believes this diligent practice is not only unnecessary, but an affront to his personal honor. Druillard objects so strongly, in fact, that he has begun to operate in open defiance of the company's policies. For several days prior to this, he had simply finished his breakfast, mounted his horse, and deftly slipped off over the hills, alone but for his single-shot rifle, his pistol, and his tomahawk. To the rest of the fur trappers, the luster of his reputation has now worn thin. He now seems to be a man lost in his own legend and bent on inviting his own destruction. The more experienced among them who have been so unlucky as to find the mutilated bodies of their comrades believe Druillard has gone insane. Again and again, the veterans among them have beseeched Druillard, as he headed out for the day, not to go out alone. But, much to their dismay, Druillard has repeatedly not only gone out alone, but returned each day with a sizable harvest of beaver. And, because Druillard has gotten these pelts on his own, he will be entitled to all of the profits that they will draw. Other than the fur company's cut, Druillard will be pocketing all of the profit from each pelt, as opposed to the 25% that the rest of his cohorts are used to. In very short order, Druillard has decided that giving up this level of profit increase for a measure of security is at once a wholly unacceptable proposition. And so, on this day, as his cohorts begin to make their way up and downstream to begin their day's labor, George Druillard again bids them a jovial farewell and heads off over the hills alone. The day passes by like any other, with some men finding their traps full and others returning to camp empty-handed. But that evening, as the men sit around their small campfire, a pensive mood begins to hang in the air. As each 4-man group makes their way back into camp, word goes around that something has gone wrong. No one has seen or heard from George Druillard all day. But nothing can be done in the dead of night, and so the men sleep as best they can before waking to another chilly riverside morning, still with no Druillard in sight. Growing more and more nervous, the men discuss how they might find and help the vaunted mountain man. In short order, a search party is sent out to comb the surrounding area, and it is only a matter of hours before the search party returns, eyes wide, faces somber, and with horrifying news to report. They have indeed found George Druillard. He had been caught alone near a small creek by a group of Blackfoot. How many, they cannot be sure, but from the number of arrows left at the scene, they assumed that there were several. To the best of the rescue party's estimation, Druillard had mounted his horse and ridden in small, feverish circles, firing off his rifle and then his pistol as he whirled. he had fought with his knife and tomahawk, and from the amount of blood on the egress trail of the Blackfoot, he had grievously wounded at least a few of them. However, his horse was ultimately shot, and Druillard was brought to the ground and drilled with arrows and lances. One can only imagine his regret after having been so assured of his safety. Once he was dead, or perhaps as he died, as was often the case in plains warfare, Druillard was eviscerated. He then had his hands and feet cut off and was ultimately beheaded. His head was never found. Terrified at both the ghastly sight before them and the very real prospect of the same thing happening to them, the search party hurriedly buried the frontiersmen in a shallow grave before making their way back to camp. The death of George Druillard is a pivotal point in the history of the American mountain man. It illustrated that even the most experienced and venerable amongst them were as vulnerable to the hand of fate as any man. From here on out, few mountain men would ever venture out alone again. But though the story of George Druillard does end here, the story of the mountain men and the tribes that they interacted with, both peaceably and otherwise, is replete with countless stories such as this one. However, for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Montana, autumn 1835. In the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, a small group of American mountain men are caught in a vicious firefight with a war party of roughly 150 Blackfoot warriors. The mountain men, at first caught in the open, have retreated to the edge of a gully and are now assembled in a loose firing line, taking cover amongst the tall pine trees. Among them is 20-year-old Isaac P. Rose, a young fur trapper from Pennsylvania. He has only seen the Blackfoot a handful of times in his burgeoning career, but never this many warriors. Now, as arrows throng into the tree trunk in front of him, he attempts to calm his nerves and reload his single-shot rifle. As he works, his hands shake, his nerves rattled by the incessant Blackfoot war whoops that fill the air. Only yards away, 3 of his comrades lie retching and screaming in pain, already victims to Blackfoot arrows and bullets. Not far from them lie a number of dead and dying horses, their death rattles and spasming adding to the already distressing scene. Finally, after what seems to Rose to be an eternity, he manages to complete the reloading of his weapon. He takes a deep breath and then peers out from behind his cover to ascertain his next Blackfoot target. What he sees floods him with a sudden feeling of relief, as the Blackfoot now seem to be retreating. The resplendent warriors, armed with bows, lances, and muskets, are now all making their way to the top of a nearby ridge, away from the mountain men's position. A wave of confusion and hopeful consolation now seems to overtake the entirety of the trappers' party. Then, suddenly, they see that the Blackfoot have set fire to the prairie that lies in front of the mountain men's position. Within minutes, the fire has spread to the timberline, and minutes later, many of the drier pine trees are alight in sickening towers of flame. The Blackfoot's intent is twofold. One, they hope to obscure the retreat of their village by filling the air with smoke. And 2, they intend to use the fire to drive their quarry from their hiding spot and out into the open. Smoke and flames now fill the air, and the oppressive heat and spectacle of the flames causes a sense of panic amongst the trappers and their horses alike. Rose, now clearly and presently in the midst of the most hair-raising ordeal of his young life, takes stock of the situation with equal parts horror and confusion, and, for at least a fleeting second, ponders how he and his comrades have come to be here, and whether or not he would have been better served simply staying on the family farm instead of seeking this life of, quote, adventure. Rose's tenure as a mountain man had begun only the year prior, in the burgeoning frontier city of St. Louis. Born to a Pennsylvania farming family in 1815, he had quickly grown tired of the limitations of seasonal farming life. Seeking his fortune, he had first moved to the city of Newcastle, some 40 miles northwest of Pittsburgh. Finding no worthwhile prospects here, he and a friend named Joe Lewis had made their way to Pittsburgh. Here, they ascertained work as deckhands on a steamboat bound for Cincinnati. The job had only steeled Rose's ambitions to find a more esteemed profession, as the entirety of the trip saw he and his companion awoken every few hours to load firewood onto the boat at each stop at ports along the river. Finally, after a short stay in Cincinnati, the pair had made their way to St. Louis. Here, they met several men involved in the fur trade, known colloquially as the Rocky Mountain Boys. Their tales of adventure and prospective riches to be had in trapping the innumerable beaver that inhabited the rivers of the frontier stoked Rose's imagination. Both young men excitedly agreed that their next venture would be as fur trappers in the Great Rocky Mountains. Both Rose and Lewis had signed up for service as camp keepers with a fur company leaving for Independence, Missouri, and within a few weeks, both found themselves on another riverboat, this one heading up the Missouri River. Both young men delighted in the prospects of their new lot in life, and dreamed of the adventures to come in fighting grizzly bears and Blackfoot, in exploring lands few had ever seen before, and in taking home a small fortune with which to finance the rest of their lives. However, the reality of the fur-trapping life was in fact far removed from the notions of adventure and exploration that abounded in the minds of both Rose and Lewis. Instead, as they had quickly learned, life as a member of a fur-trapping company was one rife with discomfort, privation, and long periods of drudgery, interspersed with moments of bone-rattling terror. And, as they had quickly surmised from their few experiences already, the greatest cause of that terror amongst any fur-trapping company in the Rocky Mountains was not the grizzly bear, the avalanche, nor the flash flood. It was, indisputably, the Blackfoot. Throughout the whole of what will eventually become the states of Montana, as well as parts of Idaho and southern Alberta, Canada, the Blackfoot are the unquestioned rulers of the land. They have ascended to this apex position via centuries of hard fighting against rival tribes like the Arikara and the Cree, taking every square mile by way of brute force and military superiority. Lewis and Clark had met the tribe on their expedition, remarking of their impressive warrior society and sheer ferocity. For decades now, they have ruthlessly defended their hard-won territories from incursions by any intruders, be they natives from other tribes or fur-trapping companies. Now, Rose, Lewis, and the rest of their companions are meeting the full weight of the Blackfoot's ire as the pine trees that surround them go up in flames, one by one, and with startling rapidity. Soon, the Blackfoot attack resumes. Several more of the horses are shot down, as the Blackfoot seek not only to trap the mountain men in flames, but to take away their means of escape as well. Several of the stricken animals make a final, primal attempt to flee from the projectiles and flames, only to fall dead in the open field that lies in front of the trappers' position. The trappers again fire a concentrated volley from their rifles into the charging warriors, again stalling their attack. But with every shot, the mountain men are further depleting their supplies of ammunition. Soon, several of the men have completely run out of bullets. Having no ability to fight any further, these men take charge of leading their increasingly panicked horses further down the hillside, away from the smoke and flames. This leaves even fewer trappers fighting back at the timberline, as the Blackfoot attacks continue to increase in both frequency and ferocity. Meanwhile, the intensity of the flames increased to such an extent that the trappers are forced to abandon their position and take to the open ground that lies directly between themselves and the Blackfoot. They are now taking cover behind the bodies of several dead horses. The ground around them is soaked in the animals' blood, making reloading and firing an even more cumbersome task. Still, amidst these gory circumstances, the fight carries on, as another attack from the Blackfoot bears down upon them. Several more warriors fall to the trappers' bullets, and the desperation of both sides becomes even more palpable as the sun reaches its noontime apex. Situated behind the stiffening carcasses of one of the unfortunate horses, with the hellscape of flames rising behind him, and the incessant attacks of the Blackfoot in front of him, Isaac Rose now finds himself out of ammunition. During a brief intermission in the fighting, he crawls from his position to the tree line and retreats down the hill in order to care for and contain the horses. He spends several minutes helping to contain the fire around the area where his comrades are holding the remaining horses, before finally deciding to scramble back up the hill and crawl back to another trapper's position, also situated behind another of the dead horses. This trapper's name is Christopher Hewson Carson, better known as Kit Carson. Roughly the same age as Rose, and himself a relative newcomer to the frontier, Carson has resolutely staked out his fighting position and, despite the chaos, appears seemingly unmoved. Rose now asks Carson if he has any ammunition that he can spare. Carson fortuitously answers that he indeed does, handing over 6 bullets along with an ample amount of gunpowder. As this transaction occurs, the two men survey the battlefield in front of them, rife with bodies of fallen warriors and horses alike. Suddenly, a patch of pine trees, untouched by the flames, catches Rose's eye. He suggests to Carson that if they can make their way to the trees undetected, they may be able to flank the Blackfoot position. Seeing no better options, Carson agrees, and the two begin a long, wary crawl to the untouched pines. On their crawl, they join forces with another trapper named Mark Head, himself hunkered down behind one of the bodies of the dead horses. The 3 men now move from position to position, inching their way ever closer to their destination, all the while waiting for the next Blackfoot attack. However, miraculously, the trio finally arrive at the lot of pine trees undetected. From here, they silently take stock of their situation. For several torturously prolonged minutes, they are unable to detect any sign of the Blackfoot. Then, suddenly, all 3 men hear 2 voices conversing in the Blackfoot language roughly 100 yards away. Peering around one of the pine trees, they see roughly a dozen Blackfoot warriors, themselves holding counsel on their next move. Sensing that now might be their only chance to avert the next attack, the 3 trappers check their weapons, and then aim and fire one after the other, hoping to elicit the illusion of being a far larger force. 3 Blackfoot warriors now tumble to the ground, thudding hard into the Montana dirt, as their comrades make a hasty retreat, riding back to the main contingent of Blackfoot who lie just over the hill. Though the trappers expect a retributive attack, one does not come. It seems that the Blackfoot, believing that perhaps reinforcements for the trappers have arrived, have chosen to vacate the battlefield, leaving the trappers to tend to their new predicament of wounded men and a gravely depleted herd of horses. The 3 trappers, Carson, Rose, and Head, make their way back to the tree line, and then down the hill, where they meet with the remainder of their comrades. They are all fatigued from the day's fighting and fearful of another surprise attack to come. Suddenly, just over the hill, they again hear the thunderous sound of approaching hoofbeats. Again, tensions rise, and the men, now nearly entirely depleted of bullets and gunpowder, again shoulder their weapons and await an oncoming attack. But, this time, they are greeted with a welcome sight. It is veteran mountain man Jim Bridger, himself already a legend on the frontier, accompanied by several fellow trappers from the American Fur Company. Hours earlier, 2 of the trappers who had been with Carson and Rose's party had escaped and alerted Bridger of their companions' plight. Though Bridger and his companions have missed the battle, they are indeed a welcome sight to all, as they bring with them much-needed ammunition, food, and water. Now, a merry scene unfolds as the trappers celebrate their surviving the day. The wounded men are attended to, with several of the mountain men, though not formally being trained, being thoroughly adept in the ways of frontier and battlefield medicine. Bridger himself, master of seemingly every facet of frontier life, tends to one of the trappers who has been hit in the shoulder by a Blackfoot bullet. Acting as battlefield surgeon, he carefully trims a pine tree branch and uses it to probe the man's wound and locate the bullet within. Finding the projectile to be lodged near the man's back, Bridger uses his large hunting knife to make an incision near the shoulder blade and extract the lead ball. He then cleans and bandages the wound before constructing a makeshift sling for the wounded man. A testament to Bridger's skill in medicine, the man will recover from his wound in mere weeks. Though the care they receive may indeed be close to premier, considering the circumstances, there is little to be offered by the mountain men in the way of empathy. The frontier is, indeed, an unforgiving place, and the mountain men have adapted, as an integral part of their culture, a dark humor, as a sort of communal therapy by way of ribbing and ridicule. As would later be described in Rose's autobiography entitled 4 Years in the Rockies, quote, "In some respects, the Rocky Mountain trapper is very peculiar. He has an eye only toward the reckless, the daring, the absurd, the humorous, and, if any one of them is green enough to tell a tale of sorrow or misfortune, instead of meeting with sympathy and condolence, he is chaffed and joked by all of them, and this eventually proves to be the best tonic, as he soon begins to think of his misfortunes as not so bad as he first thought, and in a short time will even laugh at them himself. Even in the midst of deadly conflict, when the fire was roaring and crackling in every direction, and the bullets and arrows of their enemies flying among them, the yells of 150 bloodthirsty warriors flying around them, even at such a time as this, loud bursts of laughter could be heard amongst the trappers as some witty sally met their ear. As the trappers take stock of the damages to their supplies and horses, Marquette is distraught to see that among the dead animals is his prized steed, a horse named Plute. In keeping with the mountain man's tradition of meeting sorrow with humor, in the coming months, any engagement with the Blackfoot will include his fellow trappers claiming that any warrior they brought down was, quote, "the fellow that killed old Plute." For the moment, however, it is decided that the two trappers' parties should unite and make their way over the mountains and to their winter quarters. With the winter coming on quickly, the trappers can waste no time in gathering their remaining mounts and supplies, and leaving this site at once, heading back over the looming Rockies. But they decide to spend one night at their current location before beginning their arduous trip. The next morning, just before the party departs, a few of the trappers decide to survey the lot of pine trees where Rose, Carson, and Head had hidden and made their attack. Initially, the men find nothing, but just before they make their return to their comrades, they hear a faint whimpering coming from the tall grass just beyond the pine trees. Investigating the source of the noise, they find a young Blackfoot woman. Her leg has been broken by a bullet, and she is unable to walk. Her companions, likely not seeing her because of where she fell, have left without her. The trappers, after doing all they can to assure the woman that they mean her no further harm, bring the Blackfoot woman back to their camp. Here, her wounds are dressed with the same care as the trappers had received. Each man among them, despite any lingering resentment for her fellow tribesmen, is moved not only by the severity of her injuries, but the stoicism with which she bears them. With her people now gone, and her wounds rendering her helpless, the trappers contrive to bring the woman along with them. A litter is constructed, and the woman, who informs the men that her name is Chilsippi, or Antelope, is gingerly laid onto a makeshift bed of buffalo hides strewn across the litter. Then, finally, the trappers begin their journey to Fort Hall. In the coming weeks, Chilsippi will become a treasured companion and an indispensable helper. For their part, the trappers will afford her the warmest lodge in the camp and the choicest cuts of meat. In return, Chilsippi, after roughly 2 weeks of convalescence, mends their garments and moccasins, a skill at which she shows a remarkable level of mastery and dexterity. This relationship, one forged between former combatants turned into inseparable friends, is not uncommon on the frontier. While the fight over resources and territory could, and often did, result in ruthless, bloodthirsty combat, the brutal nature of survival itself did, at times, result in brief flashes of humanity between warring parties. For their parts, Isaac Rose, Joe Lewis, Mark Head, Kit Carson, and Jim Bridger will all continue their careers in the fur trade for years to come. This period in the mid-1830s will ultimately be seen by many as the peak of the mountain man trade, and though the danger of life on the frontier would continue to be a very real threat, it is not enough to deter the countless young men who seek the prospective fame, adventure, and adulation that potentially accompany life as a trapper. Life for the Blackfoot, as well, will continue on in the ways that they have known for generations. Their lives will continue to be dictated by the same seasons of hunting, travel, and intertribal warfare that had shaped the lives of their forefathers. However, this time period will ultimately prove to be the twilight of the Blackfoot's long and storied tenure as rulers of the northern plains. In 1855, in an effort to squash intertribal warfare in the region, a treaty was signed which granted the Blackfoot and their allies the Gros Ventre rights to what is today the eastern half of Montana. But in the coming decades, this agreement would be broken time and again by the United States government. With their once expansive territory now dwindling, the Blackfoot were eventually forced to sign the Sweetgrass Hills Treaty, which essentially relegated them to reservation life from then on. But the conflict, controversy, and tragedy of the Blackfoot's plight under the U.S. government, as well as the countless tales of bravery, industry, and terror from the annals of the history of the mountain men, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Montana, 1834. In the middle of the night, a camp of fur trappers and native guides bustles with activity. Under the flicker of their campfire's light, the native Delaware warriors who serve as scouts for the trappers daub red and black war paint on their faces in intentionally frightening patterns. Under the same light, their cohorts in the mountain men, who make up the majority of this trapping party, clean their rifles and check their supplies. Though this group of men is not a military outfit, all among them are preparing for battle. The Blackfoot, the reigning and rightful rulers of this territory, have killed one of the trappers' own, a beloved man known only to posterity as Mr. Howell. The evening prior, Howell had been out checking traps with another member of the party when they had been attacked by the Blackfoot. While his companion had escaped, Howell had been mortally wounded and suffered an ugly, agonizing demise in plain view of all of his friends and comrades. Now, the blood of the trappers and native scouts runs hot for vengeance. As the Delaware scouts carry out their ritual war dance, the mountain men confer with each other in hushed, angry tones about the revenge they intend to exact upon the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot, so named by the traders from the Hudson Bay Company, who noticed that after trekking eastward to the Great Bay over grasslands that had been recently scorched by wildfires, the tribal members' deerskin leggings and moccasins were stained black with prairie soot, had long been the primary adversary in this area for not only the trappers, but many of their weaker neighbors who often bore the brunt of Blackfoot raiding and warfare. In this austere, unforgiving landscape, the Blackfoot have staked their claim, and it is well known amongst all that trespassers of any kind are not tolerated on their lands. But, however serious the consequences, the tide of fur trappers making their way north along the many rivers and tributaries that crisscross the country had been steadily increasing over the decade. Though their initial dealings with the Lewis and Clark expedition had indeed been largely peaceful, the continued incursion of trappers had been met with a consistent stream of hostilities from the mighty Blackfoot. While trappers often traveled in parties numbering in the dozens, nearly all of whom would be heavily armed, the litany list of trappers and mountain men who had lost their lives for trespassing was ever growing and well known amongst all those who ventured out on the wild expanses of the northern plains. Every man amongst the trapping party, now readying themselves for combat, had known this danger, as had their dead comrade Howell. But this does little to whet the trappers' and native scouts' appetite for vengeance in the name of their comrade. Although they are largely a motley crew of what most in the large cities back east would consider unfit for civilized society, they are not without leadership nor order. But in this harsh world, where decisions made in seconds can have consequences that spell life or certain death, allegiance and obedience are not offered in deference to office or pedigree. Here, a man's reputation and skills make him worthy of leadership, and few men on the whole of the frontier are more skilled, experienced, or well-known than the man who now leads this party of men bent on revenge. He is a tall, well-built, rangy-limbed man with a penchant for jokes and good humor, paired with an uncanny knack for survival and a hellacious bent for combat. His name is Jim Bridger. At this time in 1836, he is 32 years old, but he is already a longtime veteran of the frontier and a legend amongst his fellow mountain men. Born James Felix Bridger on March 17, 1804, in Richmond, Virginia, Bridger had been orphaned at the age of 13 and made his way to St. Louis to work as an apprentice for a newspaper printer. However, after reading one of the paper's advertisements posted by General William Henry Ashley calling for, quote, 100 men to ascend the river Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. The 18-year-old Bridger had joined up along with several other men such as Thomas Fitzpatrick, William Sublett, Davy Jackson, James Clyman, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith, all of whom would go on to become legendary mountain men in their own right. The group would go on to be known as Ashley's 100, and in the ensuing decade and a half since that advertisement's publication, Bridger and his cohorts had gone on to explore vast expanses of the American frontier that had only yet been seen by its native peoples. During this time, Bridger had survived countless clashes and run-ins with a number of tribes on the American plains. But it was the Blackfoot whom he feared most, and who most drew his quenchless ire. Now, as he makes his final preparations and mounts his horse, Bridger is silent amidst the cyclone of activity that surrounds him. There is no need nor tolerance for rousing speeches nor exhortations amongst this crowd, as Bridger well knows, and thus his instructions are terse. The Blackfoot are nearby. They are to catch them off guard and kill as many warriors as possible until they are able to drive the Blackfoot out of this vicinity. Then, and only then, will their vengeance be complete. Silently, the party now moves out, with their Delaware scouts leading the way. However skilled and reputable any of the mountain men may be, their skills in tracking are largely incomparable to their native guides who had been schooled in its practice since childhood. Now, under cover of the night, the mean-eyed and tight-lipped contingent makes its way across the sparse landscape, myopically intent on exacting their proverbial pound of flesh from their hated rivals. As the chill of the night winds envelop them, the men do their best to steady their nerves and temper their anger, lest a tactical mistake be made in this critical hour. Finally, the Blackfoot camp is in sight, but the Blackfoot sentries have alerted their comrades, and the Blackfoot are now securely ensconced in a grove of cottonwood and willow trees on the bank of a small river which runs behind them. Just before coming into rifle range of the Blackfoot, the contingent of trappers and scouts comes to a halt. Bridger and the other trappers huddle to discuss their next course of action against this unexpectedly entrenched enemy position. However, as the mountain men confer, the Delaware scouts see no need for what they believe to be baseless precautions. The Delaware, with tomahawk in one hand and rifle in the other, make an immediate headlong charge towards the Blackfoot position. They swarm into the thicket holding the Blackfoot with such ferocity that the Blackfoot are compelled to retreat, thinking that a far larger force has fallen upon them. As the Delaware hack and shoot down any Blackfoot that they can, the remainder of the Blackfoot force quickly swims midway across the river to a small island. From their positions, the still bewildered trappers can see the Blackfoot swimming across the river, holding their rifles above their heads so as not to waterlog them. Now, this band of warrior kings on the northern plains are, pitiably, trapped on an island with little cover and little possibility for escape. The trappers and Delaware scouts now take their time and ease into firing positions least exposed to the warriors on the island. The mood has now changed from one of uncertain foreboding to a level of conviviality often reserved for picnics and parties. The following account from fur trapper and participant in the battle, Isaac P. Rose, describes the scene as follows in his memoir, 4 Years in the Rockies. It may appear strange to our readers, yet it is nevertheless true that the feeling experienced by the trappers when about to make a raid on a band of hostile Indians resembles those of our country friends when going to visit a circus. It is relaxation from their usual employment, and a good time for fun, frolic, and adventure is expected. Every trapper had selected a tree or clump of bushes within fair rifle range of their enemies, and whenever a Blackfoot exposed any part of his person, a ball from one of the trapper's rifles would send the unfortunate native back to the happy hunting grounds. This fight may be considered regular target practice. One of the Indians would hoist a breechcloth above the logs, and in 1 minute it would be cut down by a bullet from one of the white men's rifles, followed by shouts and yells from the trapper who witnessed the shot. And, again, a trapper would place his wolfskin cap on his ramrod and raise it above his place of concealment, and it would soon be perforated by an Indian bullet. In this way the fight went on for several hours, but with little advantage to either party. Despite the mortal consequences, the mood is light, even when one of the trapper's own suffers a minor injury. A man named Mark Heed manages to incur a scrape on his upper arm from a bullet. The man, well known amongst his fellow trappers for his distinct, nasally drawl, cries out in shock and pain, "I've been shot!" The trappers further down the firing line from him cannot make out his words, and ask those in between themselves and Heed what the man has said. "He says he shot an Indian," yells one. The indignant tone of Heed himself then cuts through, correcting, "No, I didn't either. I said I was shot myself." The trappers instantaneously fall into an uproarious laughter, realizing that the wound is not serious and that their friend is not injured enough to encumber his personality. However, for the Blackfoot and for the Delaware scouts, there is no laughter to be had. The animus between the two tribes has run long and deep over decades of conflict, and the Delaware are intent on taking the fight to their hated enemy. As the firing carries on further down the line, a lone Delaware warrior swims his horse across the river to the foot of the island inhabited by the Blackfoot. From here, he creeps to within 50 yards of the Blackfoot position, as they remain preoccupied with firing upon the trappers across the river. The Delaware warrior, in an astonishing display of reckless vainglory, quickly climbs a cottonwood tree and takes up a position overlooking the Blackfoot. From here, he begins to pepper them with accurate sniper fire, dispatching 3 Blackfoot warriors in 3 successive shots. However, after the third warrior falls, the Blackfoot are able to ascertain the Delaware's position. Now, bark and tree limbs explode all around the Delaware warrior as he climbs down and retreats back to the foot of the island, swimming his horse back across the river to the renown and praise of his comrades. For hours more, through the afternoon and into the early evening, the fight drags on, with intermittent shots being taken, but no significant damage being done to either party. Finally, both sides are forced to make camp and break for the night, as darkness renders their targets indiscernible. The trappers and Delaware scouts make camp near the river, and rise early the next morning, intent on resuming their fight with the Blackfoot. However, upon cresting the ridge that separates their camp from the previous day's firing line, the trappers and scouts find the island deserted, the Blackfoot having absconded onto the prairie in the night. For now, life can return to the trappers' normal routine of trekking up and down streams, setting and checking traps, and completing camp chores. Jim Bridger will go on to lead this contingent to a successful haul this season, earning a worthy profit for each of the men in his charge. However, this fight with the Blackfoot will be but one of only the initial forays into combat with the mighty warrior tribe that the trappers will experience during this trapping season, before making their way to the yearly rendezvous in Wyoming to sell their furs. Though they have no intentions of settling upon this land, they are still trespassers, ones who the Blackfoot will offer no quarter to, so long as they traverse their territories. But the many tales of fights and ferocities between the mountain men, their native allies, and the Blackfoot are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click that like button to share this episode with a fellow history lover and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. It's right down there. Also, be sure to follow us on Instagram and on TikTok and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. All that is down there in the link below. I know you will love it. Thank you again for watching, and we will see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.